Hi, my kith and kin. This is Ndoro-Mkombachoto. Welcome to another episode of It Heartfelt with Gloria. Sit down, relax, but always comment and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. There are two moments in everybody's life where people gather without them being called by that particular person. The first moment is when you are born, and the second and last moment is when you die. On those two occasions, you don't call people to gather in your name. We always want to talk about birth, and we shy away from talking about death and grief and loss. As members of the human race, we have failed over the years to know what to do with particularly people who lose their loved ones. I'm not going to be the first one to lose loved ones, neither am I going to be the last. I have lost a sister before, I have lost a dad, but when I became a widow, I noticed that society started treating me differently. My name is Gloria Ndoro-Mkombachoto. Welcome to my podcast, It Heartfelt with Gloria. Today we are talking about the fact that even when we experience loss, we are more than our loss. It's very important not to define people because of their losses. And widowhood in society is one area where people are defined based on their loss of their husband. So I remember this particular day. It was the 30th of January 2021. A phone call came through from the doctor, and it was an odd phone call because the previous day the doctor had passed through our house giving us such good news that Robert, my husband, who was in hospital, was due to come back home, and he had got into hospital because of COVID. And 2 days before, they had done a test on him, and he was no longer COVID positive. So we were so excited. But at the same time, we were moving. So we were excited about going to set up a new place for him where he'll be recuperating. So the doctor said, you need to rush to hospital because Robert has turned for the worst. And we wondered what has happened in less than 24 hours. Yesterday he was doing great, and now we need to rush to hospital. So I was with my youngest daughter, and we were packing to move to an Airbnb. We had bought a home, a new home, but the home wasn't ready. So we were going to transition through the Airbnb. So we called the other kids, told them that we needed to meet at the hospital because Dad wasn't doing very well. So we rushed to hospital. When we got there, they immediately requested for us to put PPE because we were going into a ward where there were other patients with COVID. So we put on the PPE, but before we entered the ward, we were told, unfortunately, that Robert had passed. This was completely disturbing because it was the least we were expecting. We had been communicating via WhatsApp, and he had been indicating to us that he felt well, he was doing very well. And so this was a shock. My youngest daughter, who I was with, started crying. And I had to maintain composure because I needed to be resilient for her and the other children who were still on their way to hospital. So they made us proceed to the bed where Robert was lying. And unfortunately, when we got there, he was already in a state of autolysis rigor mortis. Autolysis rigor mortis is the first stage of death. You are cold. We touched him. He was cold, and but he was smiling. He looked like during his last few seconds, he had seen something pleasurable or somebody whom he recognized and somebody that he cared about very well. He was smiling and looked extremely handsome and very peaceful. My daughter continued to mourn. I couldn't. I was dumbstruck. I was in shock, and I was probably operating on autopilot. I just didn't know what was happening. So we were asked to give authority to the caretaker to come and pick him up to take him to the funeral parlor. I signed the documentation, and as we were leaving the ward, we met up with the other children, and we told them that unfortunately Dad had passed. And so we all went to the car park, and in the car park there was a mourning ceremony. It was the kids mainly crying. I was in amazing composure because I had to console them. After about a good 20 minutes, we then drove to the parlor where we met up with Robert's body. But before we had left the hospital, we had got the Lancet report, and this Lancet report indicated that 48 hours before Robert had tested negative for COVID. That Lancet report was a lifesaver because it allowed us to be treated with dignity. We were allowed to view Robert as much as we wanted. We were given the opportunity to go and get some of his old clothes so that they could bath him and dress him up. But we were also told that we could buy new clothes, which we also did. And because he died in South Africa and had to be repatriated to Zimbabwe, it took almost a week. I think it was about 7-8 days, and then he was repatriated to Zimbabwe. And on that repatriation, when we were going through the motions of repatriations, we met up with other families whose loved ones had died from COVID. And the treatment was completely different because they were being sealed up on death and then put in a coffin, which coffin was sealed up immediately, and they were not allowed to touch or even identify the body. So when eventually we got to his place of burial by Howard Mission, about 50 minutes from Harare, we made the decision not to open the casket because of the environment that we had been operating in. There were so many unknowns with COVID. Perhaps the people who had prepared him in Johannesburg and in Harare when he arrived had COVID. They could possibly had given him the COVID, and had we opened the coffin, perhaps his deceased body would have infected people. But on arrival in Harare, he spent the night at the parlor. And in the morning before we took him to Howard, those who came to the parlor had the opportunity to view him. And Then we took him to Howard, where we buried him. It was the most surreal thing, but what I remember the most is the fact that the treatment we received from the parlor was completely different from the treatment that other people whose loved ones had died from COVID received. There was no closure, there was no identification of the body. Burial, if burial was being done locally and there was no repatriation from one country to the other, was done immediately. And families, entire families were left with trauma, which they are still feeling to this day, because they don't even know whether they buried that very same person. We had a very close family friend who lost a husband, and this husband died a week before Robert had died. What happened was he got ill, he was incarcerated in a hospital. They were not allowed to see him at all. They were not even allowed to identify the body. By the time they saw the body being put in a coffin, he was already wrapped up in plastic. And then that coffin was further sealed with plastic and rushed to Warren Hills for burial. To this day, that family friend is experiencing so much trauma. She was telling me the other day that his family don't even know where he was buried because the burial was at such short notice. And I have watched her over the last 2.5 years wasting away because of the trauma. And unfortunately, our society tends to be very hypocritical. We pretend like we are giving people support when we actually are not. We go, we tick the register. I attended a memorial service. I attended a prayer meeting without trying to find out how people who have lost their loved ones during that particular time of the pandemic are feeling. The trauma still resides inside the hearts and the minds of those people. And it's so important for us to check up on people who lost loved ones during the pandemic. And when you are not close to the grief, you move on with your life, you forget. But the ones who were close to the deceased, it lingers and lingers until their very own demise. And it's very important to find platforms, even audiences, to be able to talk about it. Because when you look at the issue around death, particularly if you are a widow, it seems society doesn't know what to do with widows. It seems when somebody loses their husband, they change. But you are still the same person. You've just lost your loved one, but you remain the same person. Society needs to talk about why they treat widows differently, because society, generally speaking, doesn't know what to do with women who would have lost their husbands. If this story resonates with you, if this story is a story that is affecting you today, or you know people who are affected to this day, who suffered the kinds of things I have shared here today, please feel free to share in the comment section. I hope you've enjoyed the episode of today. It's very important that you share with us your comments about what we are sharing with you, but most importantly, some of the issues that you might feel are not being covered with our podcast or other podcasts. But please do not forget to subscribe. That will inform us in giving you more value in the future. Thank you.